Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today we're going to take a look at Rhipsalis aurea. Now, aurea is Latin and it means something like golden. So obviously this species was named for its yellow flowers. And some of you might be like, there is no Rhipsalis aurea. And that's because Rhipsalis aurea was first described in 2004. So it is a relatively new Rhipsalis species. And oddly enough, it's not even the most recently described Rhipsalis species. Rhipsalis flagelliformis was described in 2014, and Rhipsalis barthlotii was described in 2016. And oddly enough, Rhipsalis barthlotii also has highly pigmented yellow flowers. Not a lot of Rhipsalis have highly pigmented flowers. So they have hints of color, they'll have like hints of gold, hints of pink. They might be pale pink. They might be pale yellow, kind of creamy colored. If you put Rhipsalis in very, very high light, the flowers can actually be more pigmented than I think what you typically see. So sometimes be a little bit aware of that, because sometimes you might see a Rhipsalis out there and it's like, oh, you see pictures of the flowers and you're like, wow, because it's colored, but it might be more pigmented because it was put in strong light. Most Rhipsalis have white flowers with hints of color in them. The endangered status of this species is vulnerable, and that's because it's endemic to the Brazilian Atlantic forest. And a lot of our epiphytic cacti are endemic to the Brazilian Atlantic forest. And it is a place where a lot of deforestation is happening, a lot of urbanization is happening, so their natural habitat is shrinking. Something to keep in mind with this species, it's a very good idea to get these species more and more into cultivation in more of a responsible way. Don't purchase these from people who are collecting them from the wild. As much of these species as humanly possible need to remain in the wild. So make sure that you're actually getting it more from like a just commercial nursery source that was probably gifted the plant. Usually what happens is that when the species is discovered, some of it is responsibly collected. It's sent to conservatories. Conservatories sometimes will go through a process of distributing into cultivation in ways to actually try to help conserve them, because in a lot of ways, getting them into cultivation might end up being the only way that they're really conserved outside of conservatories, because their wild habitat might just completely disappear. In terms of cultivating this species, I have received this species 3 different times from 3 different sources. And I'm going to say the first time that I received it, it was shipped from quite a ways away, so it spent quite a bit of time in the mail, and it was in a plastic baggie, and by the time that I received it, a good portion of this had rotted. So the only thing that remained was really kind of the main cutting branch, and I planted that, and it rooted, and it started to grow, and then it basically immediately died very abruptly, just totally rotted away. And what's interesting is when this species kind of desiccates or dies and it starts to kind of, I don't know how to put it, but it looks like it's like black rot. But I want to be careful because that's actually something that is normal about this species that I've noticed. It's not like some weird like fungal bacterial thing that you really need to be like super worried about. It's just that when it actually rots, it's black, and that's not, like if you grow Rhipsalis, that seems kind of atypical, but it's typical for this species. So that very abruptly died. And then I received cuttings in the mail that were so far desiccated, they could never have been saved. They were basically just like dried up, crackly little twigs by the time that I got them. So that was a kind of a bad experience. I tried to root them. Of course, it didn't work. They were just too far gone. And then the third time that I tried it, I had small rooted plants. And when I got them, again, they were really desiccated. What was interesting is that like big chunks of the plant survived, and then big chunks of the plant, just did not really take. It seems as though this plant does not ship well, period. It doesn't seem like cuttings of the plant ship well or that rooted little plants ship well. It just seems to be a very fragile kind of plant. So keep that in mind. I think that, if you purchase it, you're always kind of running a little bit of a risk of that. What I learned from all of that was that this particular species likes to have its substrate a little bit more on the damp side, at least in my experience. And it also likes to have the air a little bit more humid because it just does not seem to have the same kind of water retention as most other Rhipsalis species. That doesn't mean that you need a greenhouse or anything to grow it. No, I'm sure it'll be perfectly fine growing like in a normal household environment as long as it's kept a little bit more damp. If you've had other experiences with this particular species, let me know in the comments below. I think that's just my personal experience with it. And I do know that this particular species has already kind of gotten a reputation for being a little bit more difficult to grow. With that, there are some other interesting things that I've heard about this species. One thing that I read was that when it starts to bloom, it seems to be a continuous type of bloomer. I don't know if that is true because I've only had my plant for about 6 months now. What I do know is that for only having it for about 6 months and it being a very young kind of plant, it definitely has bloomed very quickly. And it's not a fluke that this plant has bloomed very quickly because I actually have two and both of them have done it. I wanted to read a couple of excerpts from this article. The article is A New Species of Rhipsalis Cactaceae from Brazil. It was published by the American Society of Plant Taxonomists. I purchased this article from Bio1 Complete. The authors, I'm probably going to say all of these names wrong, are Maria de Fatima Freitas, Alice de Moraes Calvente, and João Marcelo Alvarenga Braga. Those are some very complicated names. But I wanted to read just two little excerpts from this article. One is considering the subgenus Erythro-Rhipsalis of Rhipsalis. It says, within this subgenus, Rhipsalis aurea is most similar to Rhipsalis pulchra, having mesotonically to subacrotonically branched stem segments, the primary of indeterminate growth, for example, with variable length, and characteristic oblique campanulate flowers. However, Rhipsalis aurea is distinct in having the primary stem segments stiff and the secondary stem segments smaller and with determinate growth. The mesotonic to subacrotonic branching pattern of both Rhipsalis aurea and Rhipsalis pulchra are characteristic of species of Lepismium. Pfeiffer has defined by Barthelot in 1987. However, neither species has the connate petals forming a floral tube and the angular pericarpal considered to be diagnostic features for Lepismium species. That is just something that I wanted to read because I found that it was really interesting because on multiple occasions now, I've gone over Rhipsalis that have this type of branching pattern that is so consistent with being a Lepismium, but they're definitely not Lepismium, and the characteristic that defines them as being Rhipsalis is their flowers. So let's go ahead and look at the State of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Cactaceae of Rio de Janeiro field guide that you can find on fieldguides.fieldmuseum.org. We're going to take a look at Rhipsalis aurea growing in the wild. Rhipsalis aurea can grow both epiphytically and epilithically, which means that it can also grow on rocks. So here we see a picture of it growing more on a rock face, which I think is pretty cool. You can see the habit looks a little bit different than when it's growing epiphytically. Here we see lots of buds, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful yellow flowers. And here we can see a little ant roaming around. And then to the right, we can see berries forming. Now, I just absolutely think these berries are fantastic. So that's basically Rhipsalis aurea growing in the wild. So let's go ahead and we'll go to gbif.org. And if we look for Rhipsalis aurea and then we look for occurrences, we will end up with nothing more than herbarium sheets here. So at the time of filming this video, of course, we have 3 herbarium sheets. And so we can just take a quick look through some of these herbarium sheets. You can see that it will show you where it was growing or where the specimen was collected from. So here you see, a dried specimen. One thing to know about the herbarium sheets that I think is kind of important is that normally they have a ruler on it, and that ruler is in centimeters, so it gives you a general idea of the size. So the size of the branches, the width of the branches, or, like in some cases with the sort of larger flat clade Rhipsalis, it'll give you an idea of how big those are, because a lot of times with those ones, pictures are really goofy and it's really, really difficult to see what the size is. And a lot of those flat clade Rhipsalis have really small clades. So here we can see a collection where the specimen type says it's the Holotype. So that would be one of the ones where the description came from was actually this species that was collected here. This actually looks a lot like the cuttings that were shipped to me. Very, very desiccated. Of course, they dry these samples. Sometimes you'll actually find samples of them being collected and stored in jars. So you'll see more of a preserved specimen that way. You can, if you scroll down on these, you can find all kinds of other information. Here again, we see another example of the Holotype. Here you can see some dried little flowers on there. And there is some information on this particular sheet. It would need to be passed through a translator. I'm not really sure what that says. Again, it says Holotype. And you can see the data that's on there was in 2004. So I actually thought this species was first described in 2009, because that's when the article was published that I was talking about from Bio 1, but it wasn't. It looks like it was described in 2004. So I just thought this was really cool. Again, we can actually look at the occurrences and zoom way in on this map, and we can see kind of the outline of the forest, and we can see where the two specimens were collected from. So I just thought that was a cool view. Why don't we go ahead and take a closer look at this plant? So here you can see it. One of the things that I think is really crazy about this plant is the speed at which it grows. So I have a lot of Rhipsalis, and some of them definitely grow very fast. I would say that this is really up there in terms of like speed of growth. It grows branches so quickly and it grows so many of them. Here you can kind of see they have this, while the older branches tend to be kind of a darker green, the newer branches seem to be this very, very bright green. It is almost kind of a fluorescent green. And if you can see here, the branches sort of have this very pliable feeling to them. So they're not very stiff. They're actually very pliable and very fragile when they very first grow out. It's really, really interesting. And if we look at these flowers, again, these beautiful bell-shaped yellow flowers, they're absolutely just fantastic little flowers. They are not scented. We'll look at more flowers here. There were a lot of little flowers. And again, this is really the size of the plant before it started blooming. You can see it's blooming off of more mature growth. So I'm going to guess that what I read is probably very true about this species, that once it kind of starts blooming, it never really stops. I think because it grows new branches at such a high rate, and then they mature, and then they would bloom when they mature. I'm going to guess that that is a very true statement about this species. So that really makes it a highly remarkable, highly collectible species. Here, if we get right up in here and we look very, very closely, we can see that the stigma tube is bright yellow, as well as the stamen. So that's something very interesting about these flowers. With a plant like this that's somewhat difficult, it is a good idea to get a backup plant. So it's usually a good idea, if possible, to get two. So here is the second plant that I got, this second little plantlet. And you can see, again, not a fluke, you can see buds forming on this plant. Again, it's forming on the growth that's a little bit more mature. The buds are crazy though, because they start out as just like these little yellow greenish looking balls, sort of toward the apex of the more mature branches. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at Rhipsalis aurea with me. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.